Chapter 9 of The Actress in High Life, an Episode in Winter Quarters, by Sue Petigru Bowen. This Librivox Recording is in the public domain. Chapter 9. When at morn the muleteer with early call announces day, sorrowing that early call I hear that scares the visions of delight away. For dear to me this silent hour when sleep exerts its wizard power. From Southey.
"I trust you rested well last night under the protection of your saintly guardians," L Isle said to Lady Mabel when she made her appearance down stairs before the sun was yet up. "Do not speak of last night," she said, throwing up her hands in a deprecatory manner. "Let it be utterly forgotten, and not reckoned among the number of the nights. It was one of penance, not repose. Never will I speak lightly of the saints again. I can only hope that that and all my other sins are expiated, if I can infer anything from the number of my tormentors."
"Were they so numerous?" L Isle asked in a tone of sympathy.
"And various," emphasized Lady Mabel. "Whole legions of various orders, light and heavy armed. I could have forgiven the first, were it only for their magnanimous mode of making war, always sounding the trumpet and giving fair warning before they charged; and the attack being openly made, I could revenge myself on some of them by the free use of my hands, and protect my face by covering it with my veil, at the risk of being smothered. But the next band were so minute and active, and secret in their movements, that I never knew where to expect them. But the last slow, heavy legion which came crawling insidiously on, were the most tormenting and sickening of all. To be tortured by such a crowd of little fiends was enough to produce delirium. But I will not recall the visions of the night. It was worse than dreaming of being in purgatory." "I am sorry to hear that you had such shocking dreams," said Mrs. Shortridge, who, as she came down the stairs, heard Lady Mabel's last words. "I would have been thankful to be able to dream; but the mule bells jingling under us all night were a trifling annoyance compared to the mosquitoes, fleas and bugs, which scarcely allowed me a wink of sleep." "Sleep!" Lady Mabel exclaimed. "They murdered sleep, and mine were waking torments." "It is allowing to the filthy habits of the nation," continued Mrs. Shortridge. "The very pigs and asses are as much part of the family as the children of the house." "The fraternization of the human race with brutes which prevails here," L Isle remarked, "certainly promotes neither comfort nor cleanliness. Indeed, it is curious that as you go from north to south, cleanliness should decline in the inverse ratio with the need of it. Compared with ourselves, the French are not a cleanly people, but become so when contrasted with their neighbors, the Spaniards, who are in turn less filthy than the Portuguese, whose climate renders cleanliness still more necessary." "By that ratio, what standard of cleanliness will you find in Morocco?" asked Lady Mabel. "Perhaps a prominent and redeeming feature in their religion," said L Isle, "may exalt the standard there. Mohammedan ablutions may avail much in this world, though little in the next." "I am afraid," said Lady Mabel, "that their cleanly superstition will make me almost regret the expulsion of the Moors." The commissary was now bustling about, hurrying the preparations for breakfast, and L Isle went to see if the servants were getting ready for the journey; but Mrs. Shortridge, full of the annoyances she had suffered, continued to denounce their small enemies. Her talk was of vermin. Lady Mabel, thinking the subject had been sufficiently discussed, interrupted her, saying, "You do not take the most philosophical and poetical view of the subject. It is not consolatory to reflect, that while men, on suffering a reverse of fortune, too often experience nothing but ingratitude and desertion from their fellows, and sadly learn that "'Tis ever thus. Those shadows we call friends attend us through the sunshine of success, to vanish in adversity's dark hour." Yet there are followers that adhere to them in their fallen fortunes with more than canine fidelity, sticking to them like their sins, clinging to their persons, cleaving to their garments, with an attachment and in numbers that grow with their patron's destitution. "But I maintain," Mrs. Shortridge replied, "that it is not only the poor and destitute that here support such a retinue. I have repeatedly seen in Lisbon and elsewhere young ladies, and among others a young widow of high rank, the sister of the Bishop of Oporto, lying with her head in the lap of her friend, who parted the locks of her hair to search " "Stop!" said Lady Mabel, laying her hand on Mrs. Shortridge s mouth. "You need not chase those small deer any further through the wood. Leave that privileged sport to the natives." Breakfast was now ready, and Shortridge called to the ladies to lose no time.
L Isle, seeing the young friar in front of the venda, brought him in, and seated him beside him. He pressed upon him many good things, which the house did not furnish ; and this being no fast day, the friar ate a meal better proportioned to his youth, his bulk, and his health, and his last night s meagre fare. He showed his patriotism by his approval of one of those hams of marvelous flavor, the boast of Portugal, the product of her swine, not stuffed into obesity in prison, but gently swelling to rotundity while ranging the free forest, and selecting the bolotas and other acorns, as they drop fresh from the boughs. The friar was not so busy with his meal, but what he continued to observe his new friends closely, and while the servants were getting their breakfast, he seized the leisure afforded to converse with L Isle, and with Lady Mabel through him. After many questions asked and answered, the friar became thoughtful and abstracted, as if he had been brought in contact with a new class of persons and ideas, which he could not at once comprehend. L Isle now asked him, when and why he had put on St. Francis frock. " I do not remember when I wore any other dress. I was not 4 years old when I was seized with a violent sickness, and soon at the point of death. My mother vowed that if St. Francis would hear her prayer, and spare me, her only son, she would devote me to his service. From that moment, as my mother has often told me, I began to mend. As soon as a dress of the order could be made for me, I put it on. From that day I grew and strengthened rapidly, and have not had a day s sickness since. When old enough I was sent to school, and then served my novitiate in the Franciscan convent in Villa Vicosa. I am now on leave to visit my mother and sisters, who live near Amechiel." " If you had chosen for yourself," L Isle suggested, " perhaps you would not have been a friar." " Perhaps not," said the young friar, hesitating. " Indeed, I have been lately told, though I am loath to admit it, that, urgent as the necessity was that gave rise to our order, and great as its services have been, especially in former days, our holy mother the Church can be better served now, by servants who assume a more polished exterior, and, obeying St. Paul s injunction to be all things to all men, mingle on a footing of equality with men of this world, although they are not of it." " Who told you this?" asked L Isle. " A learned and travelled priest, whom I lately met with. He delighted me with his knowledge, while he startled me by the boldness of some of his opinions." " But perhaps," L Isle persisted, " if left to your own unbiassed choice, you would not have taken orders at all." The young man paused, evidently unable to shut out the thought, " Are there callings which, without doing violence to my nature, are compatible with the service of God?" At length he answered, with a reserve not usual to him, " It is not every man whose way of life is, or can be, chosen by himself." Then crossing himself earnestly, as if stifling the thought, and trampling down the tempting devil within him, he exclaimed, "I must believe that my instant recovery from deadly sickness, as soon as I was devoted to St. Francis, proves that he has chosen me for his service and God s." He said this eagerly, and with an air of sincerity, and again made the sign of the cross. Yet the doubting devil seemed to linger about him, and he sunk into silence, seeming little satisfied with himself. Meanwhile, during his conference with L Isle and Lady Mabel, old Moodie stood near, eyeing him with sinister looks, as if he had been the inventor, not the victim of the popish system, and all its corruptions rested on his head. The old man now urged them to take horse, and allowed them no respite from his bustling interference, until the party was again on the road. The friar watched their motions with interest; and when, after crossing the valley and ascending the hill before them, Lady Mabel turned to take a last look at the ruinous old venda, she saw him still standing like a statue in the archway, doubtless with eye and thought following their steps. " I am afraid," said L Isle, " that our young gownsman will have to undergo a ruinous conflict in the struggle between his nature and his fate. His is the worst possible condition for a man of vigorous character and inquiring mind. He has not arrived at his convictions, but had prematurely thrust upon him the convictions he is professedly bound to hold." " And you have helped him into the conflict," said Lady Mabel, " without staying to see him through it." " I trust not. But anyhow it would have come. Were he a monk even, seclusion and devotion might protect, study might withdraw him from many temptations. Were he a secular priest, the active and definite duties of a parish, fulfilling and inculcating the obligations of Christian morals, which are the same in every church, might have tasked his energies. But to be all his life a wandering beggar, in the name of God and St. Francis! If enthusiasts are to be pitied, how much more those who, without being, are compelled to lead the life of enthusiasts Is it wonderful that many of these men are apostles only of ignorance and profligacy?" "But this young man has a mind too active and inquiring for contented ignorance," said Lady Mabel. "From his very nature he must go on adding fact to fact and thought to thought." "Until he has built up a system of his own," answered L Isle. "And 100 chances to 1 that will not coincide with the teachings of St. Francis and Rome. What must he do then? He, a professed Franciscan, has lost his faith in St. Francis, in Rome, perhaps in Christ known to him only through Rome. Must he persevere? Or shall he abjure? Between hypocrisy and martyrdom he now must choose. Think not, because the fires of the auto da fe are extinct, a churchman here can safely abjure his profession and his faith. A man may live a life of martyrdom, although he escape a martyr's death." They had ridden on some miles, and new scenes had suggested other topics, when they heard a shout behind them, and looking round, saw the old man of the venda displaying unwonted energy. He was vigorously pummeling with his heels the vicious burro on which he followed them, while he held up some article of clothing, and shouted after them at the top of his voice. They stopped for him to come up, and he handed to Lady Mabel a rich shawl, which she had left behind in her bedroom, and a scrap of dingy white paper. Refusing any reward for his trouble and honesty, he at once took leave and turned back, the ass showing a more willing spirit on his homeward path. After trying in vain to decipher the scroll, Lady Mabel handed it to L Isle. "Cito tute jugunde peregrineris." "Swift, safe, and pleasant may your journey be," said L Isle, translating it. "This is doubtless from the young friar. He is anxious to show you at once his scholarship and his good will. We must not find fault with his Latin, which is capital for a friar." "Give it to me. I will keep it as a talisman of safety, and as a memorial of our friar. Poor fellow!" continued Lady Mabel. "I suppose the best wish I can return him is, that enthusiasm may carry him, in sincerity and purity, through the path others have chosen for him." "He is an impudent fellow," growled out old Moodie. "You set too great store, my lady, by this young vagabond." "Vagabond!" she exclaimed, with a look and tone of grave rebuke. "I am afraid, Moodie, if you had met St. Paul wandering through Macedonia without staff or scrip, or the cloak he left behind at Troas, you would have found no better title for him." "Is this man like St. Paul?" asked Moodie, startled at the profane supposition. "I do not say so. But the whole order of friars, renouncing worldly objects, devote themselves to the imitation of the 70 disciples in Scripture, who were sent out by 2 and 2 to evangelize the Jews." "I never expected, my lady, to hear you liken these lazy monks to our Lord's disciples." "They are not monks, but friars," said Lady Mabel, quietly; "and, without answering for their practice, I cannot but approve of what they profess. They do not shut themselves up from the world, like the monks, under pretence of escaping contamination, but devote themselves to the mission of traveling about in apostolic poverty from house to house, and, by prayer and preaching, by inculcating charity, and receiving alms, sow everywhere the seeds of the faith they profess." "The words of old Chaucer puts into the mouth of his friar," said L Isle, "well express the objects of the order. "In shrift, in preaching is my diligence, and study, in Peter's words and in Paul's. I walk and fish Christian men's souls, to yield my Lord Jesus his proper rent. To spread his word is set all mine intent." "A truly apostolic aim!" Lady Mabel exclaimed, looking triumphantly round on her old follower. The descending road here narrowed suddenly, and Moodie reined back his horse, silent in the sad conviction that Lady Mabel had already got beyond that half way house between the region of evangelical purity and idolatrous Rome. In the narrow valley, overgrown with shrubs and brushwood at the foot of the hill, they came suddenly on a large number of swine luxuriating in the cool waters, or on the shady banks of a brook. The swine vanished instantly amidst the thickets, though hundreds were still heard grunting and squealing around them, and the travelers might have taken them for wild denizens of the wilderness, had not a fierce growl attracted their attention, and they saw on the opposite bank a man reclining under a carob tree, one hand resting on the neck of a huge dog, who yet showed 2 savage rows of teeth, and fixed his vigilant and angry eyes on the intruders. The wild air of the master delighted Lady Mabel, for there was mingled with it a savage dignity, as he stretched his manly form on the wolf skin spread out under him, and gazed calmly on the party drawing near. While their horses stopped to drink at the stream, they observed him narrowly, he receiving this attention with stoic indifference. A long gun lay on the ground beside him, and his garments, made chiefly of the dressed skins of animals, defied briar or thorn. "Are we on the road to Evora?" L Isle asked, by way of opening a parley; but the man merely waved his hand gently toward the hill and path before them. Resolved to make him speak, L Isle asked, "What game have you killed to day?" For he saw some animal lying in the moss at the foot of the tree. The hunter silently held up a lynx and an otter, which he had lately snared, and seemed to forget the presence of strangers in contemplating his game. Despairing of extracting a word, the travelers rode on. "What a silent, unsocial wretch!" Mrs. Shortridge exclaimed. "He seems to prefer the company of a savage hound and his dead game to that of living Christians." "He thinks a heretic no Christian, if he thinks at all," said L Isle, and he called to the guide to ask what this wild man was. "He is a swineherd." "Indeed!" said Lady Mabel. "I took him for a bandit, or a bold hunter, at least." "But he is the swineherd of the great monastery of the Paulists, who own half the lands on the southern slope of Serra d Ossa. He is a matchless hunter, too, spending fewer nights under a roof than on the mountain side, where all the game is as much his as the swine he keeps is the property of the good fathers. They have the best bacon in all Portugal, and plenty of it, as many a poor man can tell; and they know this man's value, for he were a bold thief that pinched the ear of his smallest pig." "As soon as I get back to Elvas," said Lady Mabel, "I will send Major Warren to make his acquaintance. The Major will be charmed with him; for his ambition is to take all sorts of game, in every possible way, and though I have, or might have had, the history of all his hunts by heart, neither lynx or otter has yet figured in the scene. You remember, Colonel L Isle, how much satisfaction he expressed when you lately hinted at the probability of our brigade finding itself in the north of Portugal, early in the coming campaign. I at first thought that the soldiers saw some military advantage in the movement, but found it was only the sportsman s delight at the hope of visiting Truzos Montes, and killing one of the few Caucasian goats that yet linger on the most inaccessible heights there." "No gamester," said L Isle, "is more a slave to the dice. That at this time a soldier should be so little lost in the world s debate, as to be eager above all things to kill a goat." They had now reached a point which gave them a fine view of the southern side of Serra d Ossa, so different from the northern, being fertile, and showing many a cultivated spot upon its lower slopes, while the light fleecy clouds, gathering before the gentle western wind, now veiled and then revealed the overhanging dark blue ridge that crowned the scene. The guide pointed out the broad possessions of the great monastery of the Paulists. At a distance, on the right, rose Evora Monte, built like a watch tower on a lofty hill; and to the south, the monastic towers and Gothic spires of Evora, the city of monks, raised high above the plain, could be seen from afar. "Why," asked Mrs. Shortridge, "do these people always build their towns on hills?" "That is a true English question," answered L Isle. "At home, in our bleak northern climate, we naturally seek sheltered situations. These people as naturally select an airy site, above the parching heat and poisoned air of the valleys. In founding colonies in tropical countries, we English and the Dutch have constantly blundered, acting as if still at home; and choosing low and pestilential spots, establish only hospitals and graveyards where we meant to build towns; while the Spaniards and Portuguese, from the instinct of habit, select the most salubrious situations within their reach. Moreover, high points are safer from attack, and stronger to resist an enemy; and the Christians of the peninsula were taught by 7 centuries of conflict with the Moors, that the safety of a man s house is the first point, its convenience the second. Now we islanders have long been but a half military people. Content with incurring the guilt of war abroad, we have carefully abstained from bringing it home to our own doors." "But we never wage any but just wars," said Lady Mabel. "We at least," said L Isle, "always find some plausible grounds on which to justify our wars to ourselves." They were now on the outskirts of the undulating plain, on which a rich soil overlying the granite rocks extends from Evora southward to the city of Beja. The signs of cultivation and population multiplied as they went on. The fields became larger and more frequent. Detached farmhouses were seen on either hand, and they fell in on the road with many peasants riding large and spirited asses, or driving oxen, all light bays with enormous horns, and so sleek and well grown, that the commissary gazed on them with admiring eye and watering mouth, and pronounced them equally fit for the yoke or the shambles. It was a relief to find themselves once more in a cultivated country, and Lady Mabel gazed round, admiring the prospect. "There is," she observed, "one drawback to the landscape. At home, one of the most enlivening features in our rural scenes are the white sheep scattered on the hills, but here they are almost black." "But the goats you see are generally white," answered L Isle. "It is, too, the more picturesque animal, and well supplies what is wanting in the sheep." Evora was at hand. L Isle launched out into an erudite discourse on the aqueduct of Sertorius, which, stretching its long line of arches from the neighboring hills, was converging with their road to the city. As they entered it, he was giving Lady Mabel all the pros and cons as to whether it was really the work of that redoubtable Roman. The commissary was luxuriously anticipating the shade and rest before him, when, to his surprise and regret, L Isle led the party another way, and halted them before a small but striking building, which here crowned the aqueduct at its termination in the city. "Look, Lady Mabel. Observe it well, Mrs. Shortridge. This castellum is a miniature embodiment of Roman taste and skill in architecture. This is no ruin calling upon the imagination to play the hazardous part of filling up the gaps made by the hand of time. We see it as the Moor, the Goth, the Roman saw it, save the loss of a few vases which adorn the depressed parapet, and the scaling plaster which here and there betrays that the builder used that cheap but immortal material, the Roman brick." Much did Lady Mabel admire this architectural gem, scarcely tarnished by the elements in 19 centuries, and much more would L Isle have found to say of it, when the commissary, impatiently fanning himself with his hat, ventured to ask, "How much longer shall we stay broiling in the noonday sun, staring at this Roman sentry box?" "Sentry box?" said Mrs. Shortridge, with a puzzled air. "Were the Romans a gigantic people?" "There were giants in those days," said Lady Mabel gravely, gazing on the castellum. But a crowd of idlers and beggars began to collect around the cavalcade, and turning, they rode off, and were soon enjoying the shelter, if not the more substantial hospitality, of the Estalejem de San Antonio. CHAPTER X.